I guess I felt like I should start by saying like this paper is nostalgic for the 60s and 70s. I thought very much after Romy talked about whether or not my paper fell into this category, and I think it does, although for reasons that are, maybe distinct, because it's not, it's a paper about official culture, not about sort of, rebellious or, counterculture. It's actually, about the socialist culture at the time. So hopefully then it will develop. I mean, I'm assuming that people know relatively little about Albania, but I've also tried to keep it, both open but also specific to one particular case. So by way of introduction, I'd like to consider a photograph taken by Petrit Ristani, published in a 1973 photo book entitled Memorials of Albanian Heroism, that documented the achievements of monumental sculpture in Albania up till that year. The photo's subject is the imposing Mother Albania monument, completed in 1971 and inaugurated in 1972 in the Cemetery of the Martyrs of the Nation in Tirana. Taken from the eastern arm of the cemetery, the location of the camera is low, just at the level of the tops of the graves. We are in the first row of graves below the central plaza, watching a ceremony unfold. At right, rows of soldiers stand at attention, and the political elite are visible clustered around the base of the monument. Only a few objects rise above the horizon line: the tops of distant hills, the heads of those gathered for the ceremony, the bus at left, a few trees. In contrast to these diminutive forms, at center, against a stretch of billowing cumulus clouds, Mother Albania pierces the blue sky with a raised hand, holding aloft a star and laurel branch. The photograph derives an important sense of stability from the monument. The steady line of the graves leads our eye to Mother Albania's pedestal and up to the clear profile of her body. The photo has captured the sculpture from just enough of an angle that the figure is fully legible as figure and not as abstract form. However, the pose of the figure itself has forced a particularly significant decision upon the photographer. For, of course, in order to be legible to the figures gathered below, the Mother Albania monument leans slightly forward, her upper body and raised arm pushing outward against the verticality of the pedestal. And yet Ristani has attempted not only to center the monument, but also to orient its upward movement precisely to the photograph's vertical axis, which in turn has thrown the stable horizontal and vertical lines of the cemetery's architecture slightly ajar. Slight though the disturbance is, its effect is compounded by the discrepancy of clarity within the photograph. The camera's focus on the monument has simultaneously put the nearby gravestones out of focus, creating a sense of movement towards the center, as if toward an event of synthesis. But the center, the form of Mother Albania, is already moving obliquely to our position, as the swelling flow of her robes makes evident. We will intersect with her form and the event it symbolizes, at most for a moment at a single point. Ristani's photograph, I want to say, quite concisely embodies a set of concerns about the relationship between history and socialist experience that characterize the transition between the 1960s and the 1970s in the People's Socialist Republic of Albania. The photograph sacrifices one kind of compositional clarity, the absolute stability of the cemetery's architecture, the horizontal accumulation of a collective past, right, the actual phenomenological experience of being at the ground, in order to grasp another kind of certainty, the belief in the absolute vertical movement of history surging upwards in messianic eruption. The photograph seems to be quite aware of the impossibility of holding together these disjunctive conceptions of history, of smoothly merging the experience of occupying the cemetery space and the steady progress of building socialism with the model of a revolutionary break in time, the emergence of a new standard for history. Yet the fact remains that official culture in late 60s and early 70s Albania was concerned with resolving precisely this aporia, and perhaps nowhere was this more evident than in the whirlwind of memorialization that occurred during these years. This project of memorialization grappled not just with history, but specifically with how one should make history a space and how one should occupy that space, and thus with it, it attempted to resolve the question of the relationship between an increasingly modern or modernist architecture and the heritage of socialist realist figurative sculpture. And it's this attempt that I want to examine today through a consideration of the martyr cemeteries in general, and then particularly I'll return to this one, the Cemetery of the Martyrs of the Nation in Tirana. But first, some brief background. Between 1966 and 1969, the dictator of Albania, Enver Hoxha, implemented his own cultural revolution, which was modeled quite closely on Mao's in China, which involves significant political, industrial, and cultural changes in Albania. These continued up until the early 70s, particularly beginning in 1972, which was the beginning of Albania's break with China, by that point the only country with which Albania maintained serious political relations. So they'd already long since broken off their relationship with the Soviets, and then were gradually cutting off their relations to others, and then finally beginning in 72, they stopped having serious relations with China. Finally, the Cultural Revolution, specifically for the arts, sort of ends definitively in 1973 with a sort of what subsequently became infamous Fourth Plenum of the Central Committee, which among other things quite strictly declared that foreign influences in art were to be strictly condemned. So it was really in 73 that people who produce something that could be labeled as modernist begin to go to prison. But like up till that point, there's still this kind of like uncertainty, which is the uncertainty that I'll attempt to make maybe coherent today. From the late 60s and into the early 70s, there was a general proliferation of the state commission and execution of memorials dedicated to the country's past as part of the project of constructing and unifying a shared sense of history among its citizens, right, who prior to the socialist years had very little experience living under sort of a shared government, so that it's also nationalism, of course, begins in the late 19th century, but is really solidified by the practices of memorialization and other kinds of cultural practices under socialism. This was a period in which the relationship between figuration and abstraction in socialist Albanian art was, to a degree, open for debate, and as such, the formal language of memorialization often oscillated between the legibility of figurative sculpture and the abstraction of architectonic environments. One of the most important places where this oscillation unfolded was in martyr cemeteries, spaces devoted to commemorating those who had fallen to free Albania from Italian and German fascist occupation during the National Liberation War, Socialist Albania code for World War II. As art theorist Gazim Cendro has pointed out, the martyrs' cemeteries were crucial heterotopias in socialist Albanian society, functioning as sites where memories of recent past struggles were embodied and the hope for the utopian communist future was projected. They served as venues for activities ranging from excursions for school children, where they would sort of sit, they'd place flowers, they'd play games, they'd hear stories from heroes, I mean, the typical kinds of youth activities in most socialist countries, as well as venues for spectacles on commemorative days such as May 5th, the Martyrs' Day, and here I've actually shown you both. Later on I'll show you the location, but the original Tirana Martyr Cemetery, much simpler, and then a photograph from the inauguration on Martyrs' Day. The configuration of martyr cemeteries constructed in socialist Albania is much too broad to address here, even if I were to limit myself just to the sort of 60s and 70s period. But I'll tell you just a little bit about them. They're generally associated with mid to large size settlements, usually not with villages. They contain the graves, or at least grave markers, of partisans and resistance fighters from that town or region. Most built in elevated locations, often on a hillside on the outskirts of the town or city. Most of them included a central sculptural configuration, sometimes figurative, sometimes architectonic, and sometimes a combination of the two. For the moment, I'll set aside the ones that contained just socialist, realist, like figurative sculptures, which were either concrete or bronze, and talk a little bit about the ones that contained just abstracted forms. When cemeteries lacked figurative centerpieces, they most often contained a particular kind of monument that the Albanians refer to as a lapidar. The lapidar as an aesthetic form is interesting because its development, for one thing, is not really chronicled in official discourse, partially because it's distinct from the development of socialist realism. So it occupies this weird space between a kind of like discourse on architecture, and many of them are realized by architects, and a discourse on sculpture, but of course it's hard to say like they are socialist realist because they don't often depict anything. They're one of the most ubiquitous forms of the materialization of history in socialist Albania. I mean, literally, they're all over roadsides. I mean, according to figures, I mean, somewhere like around over 700 of them were constructed in the country. So they're quite like almost anywhere you go where there was any kind of event, there's a lapidar dedicated to it. The socialist state framed lapidars as an organic evolution of the stone cairns or grave markers erected contemporaneously with the partisan struggle in order to commemorate battles and fallen comrades. But the evolved aesthetic of the lapidars is undeniably like just as indebted to the geometric forms of something like the Russian avant-garde or the Bauhaus. Essentially, the lapidar is a monumental form, often vertical and rectilinear, such as an obelisk, but frequently accompanied by horizontal elements constructed variously of stone, concrete, and brick. Usually they were painted white, with parts of them painted red. They nearly all contain a star somewhere close to the apex. And almost all of them feature a commemorative plaque because they're supposed to be educative. The lapidars worked as a semiotic system that articulated a relationship between a calendrical history of key events, an ongoing process of socialist production, and the phenomenological experience of the viewer encountering the lapidar. So that there's actually like sort of travel logs that published in the magazines where they talk about like driving down the road and seeing, you know, passing from one to another as you go from one village to the next. This semiotic system, of course, also was linked spatially to the territory of the Albanian state, with the lapidars forming a network of nodes in both time and space that allowed one to traverse history. And also, of course, aesthetically, they kind of architecturalize a sort of wild, rugged landscape in a way that's similar to like the bunkers, which I won't talk about here, but are another example of this, like the architecturalization of the Albanian state under socialism. When lapidars appeared in martyrs' cemeteries, they linked this calendrical network of historic moments in the partisan struggle to this like other space of anticipatory hope that potentially occurs in the cemeteries. Part of what's interesting about their presence in the martyrs' cemeteries is that they imply the importance of purely symbolic form. That is, visitors to the cemeteries did not encounter a literal embodiment of the fallen buried, that is to say, like they didn't encounter a figure of a partisan, but instead an abstract or at least abstracted form that served to orient the viewer's experience of the cemetery and of history purely through the deployment of volumes in space. In fact, at the outset of the 1970s, art critic Kwitim Buza protested against the proliferation of realist partisan sculptures in martyrs' cemeteries on the grounds that overemphasizing the partisan struggle in fact detracted from visitors' understanding of the importance of historical change occurring in their own time. The cemetery was not merely to function as a space of mourning, it was also specifically to emphasize the production of surrounding reality, the building of socialism, and one way of emphasizing that was to mobilize an architectonic language as opposed to, or alongside, a figurative one. Indeed, it was not simply that socialist aesthetics in early 1970s Albania held symbolic form to be compatible with representation or iconic signs. According to Andon Kuchali, one of the most prominent sort of critics and historians in socialist Albania, elevation to the status of symbol constituted the highest realm of artistic realism. That is, the semiotic category of the symbol was broad enough to encompass both the aesthetics of socialist realist figuration and of abstract architectural or architectonic form, which would otherwise have sort of been dismissed as modernist, but here was able to be sort of recuperated under the idea that architecture is also a symbol. This tolerance for the abstract symbol in the context of memorial sculpture can, I think, be understood in the context of the drive to materialize history, even as the form of history was deemed to be uncertain. As I said before, the late 60s and early 70s in Albania were a time when official culture, almost in spite of itself, sought to produce a proliferation of the forms of experience of history. So especially in 1968, there's this like referendum on monumental propaganda, where it, like really what they assert is just like we need more of any type of anything in terms of commemoration. So that it's like there's this vague push for as much as possible, as soon as possible. Thus, if we consider a martyrs' cemetery like the one in Libraj in central Albania, we'll see two forms of aesthetic experience attempting to resolve into one kind of symbol, one kind of real experience of history. Here, however, the distinction between the two is preserved both in style and in material, so that at least I think no matter how much we envision a sort of productive aesthetic juncture between the two, we still see the architectonic components as essentially a stage for the figural elements, and in doing so we lose some of the potential significance of really thinking history as abstract form. There were, however, times when attempts were made to combine the language of architecture's abstract symbolism and the figuration of socialist realism in one form, and for the rest of the talk, I would like to return to the Cemetery of the Martyrs of the Nation in Tirana and to the Mother Albania monument. So to reiterate, the claim that I want to make is twofold. First, I want to posit this cemetery and its monument as an illustration of this attempt to work out a sense of time and history that would both establish the unity of a collective past and link it to the present moment, while at the same time holding open this kind of idea of revolutionary capacity of history, right? That things could suddenly change. That was particularly necessary in this political period of finally breaking away from everyone else. So it's what do you replace all of that with? We need our own revolution. Second, I want to say that the way the builders of the cemetery envision the relationship between space and monument, and also between the architectural elements or architectonic elements and figuration, relates to this kind of vertiginous historical navigation. The Cemetery of the Martyrs of the Nation was not always in its present location. Until early 1972, it occupied, in a much more modest form that we saw earlier, a section of the hill of St. Procopius nestled in Tirana's Great Park. In 1964, the decision was made to move the cemetery, and in 1966, right at the outset of the Cultural Revolution, a competition to design the new cemetery was held. The winning variant was that put forward by the group working in the architecture department of the University of Tirana, which included architect Enver Faya and sculptors Kristaç Rama, Shaban Haderi, and Muntaz Darami. Together with Faya, the team of sculptors from the university presented several variations of their model, most of which contained a central obelisk or stylized flag form with a sculpture of either a partisan or an embodiment of Mother Albania standing before it. Ultimately, however, the accompanying abstracted elements were considered too modernist. Right, I mean, this was supposedly specifically Hoxha's commentary, was that they were too modernist. And the figure of Mother Albania alone was selected as the centerpiece for the cemetery. In the absence of accompanying architectonic elements, however, the figure of Mother Albania was called upon to mediate between two aesthetic paradigms, or perhaps more accurately, to occupy both at once. And the formal resolution that Rama, Haderi, and Darami arrived at emphasized a tense dialectical synthesis between figuration and abstraction. In essence, Mother Albania's body itself became a lapidar, her left arm jutting out horizontally, her right arm holding aloft the star, nearly always found atop lapidars. And I'll just say, the other obvious connection here, as we'll see when I show you the other side of it, right, is that it looks like the female half of Mukhina's, sculpture. But I think that it's because at this point people are no longer sort of publicly aware of the relationship to the heritage of Soviet sculpture, I'm actually more interested in looking particularly at this in the context of what other things are going on in Albania at that point, which is why I'm sort of leaving aside an obvious set of figurative predecessors to this monument. To create the feeling of perpetual forward motion and dynamism and to counter the stark frontal verticality of the woman's body, the sculptors extended Mother Albania's robes back, transforming them into angular waves terminating in geometric shapes hovering in space. In doing so, they presented Mother Albania's corporeality as a manifestation of history at once rigid and in perpetual flux. On the one hand, her whole body appears to be dissolving and then reforming, abstracting into pure matter. At the same time, however, her starkly vertical poise and stoic visage appear as the coalescence of the abstract pleats flowing behind her. Mother Albania materializes the sacrifices of those buried in her shadow, just as the cemetery itself materializes the intergenerational labor of socialism's construction, extending into the past, present, and future. The horizontality of historical narrative is elevated to a higher level of meaning by the upward thrust of her hand, raised and grasping the star and laurel branch. The cemetery becomes a space for interruption precisely in the figure of Mother Albania in its middle position between legibility and oblivion. The encounter with this monument, the figure as both a rupture and synthesis of history, is reinforced by the trajectory with which viewers encounter the work. The plan of the cemetery extends out in a great arc spanning over 300 meters, with the sculpture at its apex. Entering the cemetery via the western side of the complex, one approaches Mother Albania incrementally as one ascends the sets of stairs leading up to the central plaza, viewing the work at first from the side and only finally coming around before the figure on the plaza. So first you see this, and then gradually you come around to stand in front of her. Approaching the monument from the east produces a similar effect, though the ascent is more gradual. Furthermore, this avenue also asserts the juxtaposition between the horizontal regularity of the graves, laid out in 9 distinct levels, and the perceived motion of Mother Albania from dynamic oblivion into comprehensible figure. The multiplicity of the graves and their anonymous geometricity is summoned out of oblivion and gathered in the monument, which both humanizes them and preserves their abstract form. Both trajectories from either extreme of the cemetery's arc emphasize the experience of history's coalescence in Mother Albania's elusively legible corporeality and the subsequent transmutation of both history and body upwards into symbol. The very character of the arc as a path of perambulation, however, reinforces the idea of an encounter, an intersection, an event that both ruptures human experience of duration, right, so that the figurative element sort of like breaks the architectural experience and punctuates the movement of history. So that there's always something like, at least I think, fleeting, but also sort of, I mean, it both coalesces, but it's also sort of like momentary, because usually you see it from the side abstractly. I'd like to conclude by considering another photograph, this one an aerial photo published on the front page of Voice of the People, which is the primary daily newspaper published under socialism, published on May 6, 1972, one day after the cemetery's inauguration. The photo, which is one of the very few, and I might even say the only, but I haven't looked at every photo ever, so I can't say that, one of the very few aerial photos of martyrs' cemeteries published in socialist Albania mapped the space's shape in a way that phenomenological experience could not. It projected a point from which the arc of the past and the dynamic eruption of the present could be grasped as a coherent whole, an angle that would capture the simultaneity of historical extension and the monumental body in which revolutionary realization was materialized. The technological vantage point of the photograph, however, also seems to deny the possibility of a transformation that cannot already be grasped by the camera's eye. Here, the promise is not so much of a dialectical synthesis as of simple summation. The cemetery itself begins to look like a maquette of itself. If we consider this photograph alongside the one by Petrit Ristani, with which I began the talk, we can see two different interpretations of the martyr cemetery as environment, two corresponding ideas about the experience of history therein. In Ristani's photograph, I've tried to argue there is an awareness of the conflict between the experiences of time, between embodied position of the viewer in the cemetery, the horizontal stability of the past embodied in the regularity of graves, the perceived motion of the monument, both forward and upward, and the vertiginous yet limited focus of the camera's lens, the momentary glimpse of transformation. A very different ideology, I think, is posited by the aerial photograph of the cemetery, right? One is 1 year earlier than the other, just to keep that in mind. Here, time is swallowed up by space, and the privileged position of the eye seems to resolve all conflicts rather than to acknowledge them, right? I think it actually reduces the need for synthesis because we see it all. Ultimately, this was the view that won out, even if it was never again so explicitly visualized as in the aerial photograph published in '72. The history of socialist Albania and the history of its art became increasingly comprehensible from above, so to speak. But for a time, perhaps 6 years at most, there was a possibility of another understanding of art's relation to historical experience, and a possibility of confronting history as something both abstract and phenomenologically embodied, and ultimately unknowable. There was the possibility of a different set of futures. Thank you.